The creation of the Duma in 1905 forced the tsarist regime to accept a limited form of constitutional government for the first time in Russian history. In the short term, these reforms helped calm the revolutionary crisis by offering political concessions to those seeking change. However, they also divided the opposition movement. Moderate liberals welcomed the October Manifesto and the establishment of the Duma, viewing them as important first steps toward a more democratic and constitutional system. More radical critics of the regime, however, dismissed the reforms as inadequate and insincere. They argued that the Tsar remained too powerful and that meaningful change could not occur within the existing political system. As a result, they continued to advocate revolutionary action rather than gradual reform. Among these radicals was Vladimir Lenin, a determined revolutionary whose ideas and leadership would eventually reshape Russia and profoundly influence the course of world history. He was born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, changing it to Lenin in 1901 as a pseudonym when he wrote for the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party's newspaper. A committed Marxist, Lenin believed that the reforms introduced after the revolution of 1905, including the creation of the Duma, were little more than superficial concessions designed to weaken the revolutionary movement and preserve the Tsarist system. He rejected gradual reform and argued that true justice and social equality could be achieved only through the violent overthrow of the existing political order. In 1905, Lenin's followers, the Bolsheviks, participated in revolutionary uprisings in Moscow that resulted in heavy fighting and the deaths of approximately 1,000 people. When the rebellion was crushed, Lenin was forced to flee Russia. Over the next decade, he lived primarily in exile in Switzerland, where he spent his time developing revolutionary theory, writing political pamphlets, and meeting with fellow Marxists. During World War I, Lenin also benefited from support provided by the German government, which viewed him as a useful tool for destabilizing Russia, one of Germany's principal enemies. Although separated from his homeland, Lenin remained committed to revolution and patiently waited for the opportunity to return to Russia and put his ideas into action. While radicals fought to overthrow the government, most Russians were initially willing to give reform a chance. The Duma seemed like a promising first step, and Nicholas II appeared to act in good faith when he appointed a competent and forward-thinking Prime Minister, Pyotr Stolypin. Stolypin sought to modernize Russia while preserving the Tsarist monarchy and preventing further revolutionary unrest. As Prime Minister, he focused particularly on agricultural reform, believing that a stable and prosperous farming population would strengthen the empire. Although peasants had been freed from serfdom in 1861, many remained burdened by heavy debts and trapped in inefficient communal farming systems. Stolypin worked to reduce these financial burdens and encourage peasants to become independent landowners. His government purchased land from large or unproductive estates and made it available to more capable and ambitious farmers. Those who prospered under these reforms became known as kulaks, a new class of relatively successful peasant landowners. While Stolypin hoped this group would become a conservative force loyal to the monarchy, the reforms also had unintended consequences. Many poorer peasants who failed to benefit from the changes lost access to land and migrated to Russia's growing cities in search of work. There, they joined the expanding urban proletariat, a population that would later provide crucial support for the revolutionary movements that ultimately overthrew the Tsarist regime. Stolypin's reforms offered Russia a possible path toward modernization without revolution. His policies were intended to create a stable and prosperous class of independent farmers, encourage economic growth, and gradually strengthen the social foundations of the monarchy. Success, however, depended on stability and patience. The new class of kulaks needed time to expand and become a reliable force in rural society. Russia's industrial sector needed time to develop and absorb the growing labor force, while the country's emerging political institutions required time to gain legitimacy and effectiveness. Yet the conditions necessary for these reforms to take root never fully materialized. Political tensions remained high, social divisions persisted, and international crises continued to threaten stability. Before Stolypin's vision could be realized, Russia would be swept into events that deprived it of both the peace and the time needed for gradual reform. Despite the reforms introduced after 1905, Revolutionary groups remained determined to overthrow the Tsarist regime and continued their campaign of violence and agitation. Between 1906 and 1907, Russia was shaken by more than 4,000 political assassinations, as well as widespread bombings, attacks on government officials and police, and persistent labor unrest. These acts of violence reflected the deep divisions within Russian society and the growing influence of radical movements that rejected gradual reform. As the architect of the government's modernization efforts, Stolypin became a frequent target of revolutionary hatred. In 1911, he was assassinated by a gunman while attending an opera performance in Kiev. His death removed one of the last capable and determined reformers within the Tsarist government. Without Stolypin's leadership, Russia lost its best opportunity for gradual change, and the regime increasingly drifted back toward repression, political stagnation, and administrative incompetence, leaving it even less prepared for the crises that lay ahead. Although Russia now possessed a representative assembly in the form of the Duma, Nicholas remained unwilling to surrender meaningful political authority. He consistently limited the Duma's powers, dismissed or dissolved it when its members challenged his policies, and manipulated election laws to reduce the influence of liberals and other reform-minded groups. Despite the appearance of constitutional government, real power remained concentrated in the hands of the Tsar and his advisors. Over time, Nicholas increasingly relied on conservative and reactionary figures, including the controversial mystic Grigory Rasputin, whose influence further damaged the credibility of the monarchy. The result was a government trapped between competing pressures, too repressive to satisfy liberals seeking reform, too weak to suppress revolutionary movements, too divided to carry out effective modernization, and too inflexible to adapt to changing circumstances. By the early 20th century, the Tsarist regime had become increasingly fragile, and it would soon face a challenge greater than any it had previously encountered. That challenge arrived in 1914 with the outbreak of World War I, a conflict that would expose the empire's weaknesses and ultimately bring down the Romanov dynasty.